That's my expertise.
There were bombing, all the roads were blocked, all the transport went on hold.
In the face of Russia's invasion, the EU and its partners launched solidarity lanes, alternative transport routes to keep Ukraine's imports and exports flowing.
The problem we are trying to solve is no way regional but global.
The war has brought us closer together, and these new connections are here to stay.
We have to do that, and Slava Ukraini.
Ya sé que los premios no lo son todo, pero cuando veo un espacio lleno de ellos, impresiona. A menudo los premios dicen mucho de una persona. Pasión, compromiso. Siempre que no sea un trofeo cualquiera que algunos exhiben en su despacho. Es difícil encontrar un broker que cumpla con todas sus expectativas. O quizá no tanto. Active Trades, broker online desde 2001.
A ver, papi, ¿cómo que lo tienes clarísimo y que tenemos que invertir ahí?
Pero si no sabes ni reiniciar el router.
Ladrillo, papi, ladrillo.
Si vas a invertir, invierte en algo que puedas tocar. Urbanitae, inversiones inmobiliarias.
¿Tú esto lo has hablado con mamá?
Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos de nuevo a Rolling Stocks. Espero que estén genial esta semana del lunes 17 de abril, que arranca ya con los mercados. Un poco en tono de no sé a dónde mirar, no sé qué hacer, no sé ahora mismo dónde estoy. Veíamos cómo la encuesta de la American Association de Inversores Individuales, la AAII, sacaba su última encuesta esta semana y mostraba que el tono neutral ha incrementado drásticamente. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Que la gente no está votando sobre que el mercado está alcista, ni tampoco está votando sobre que el mercado está bajista. Donde se están concentrando ahora los mayores votos en la encuesta es un signo neutral en el sentimiento, aunque hay algunos datos que también muestran sentimiento bastante bajista, como por ejemplo esas posiciones cortas que veíamos la semana pasada dentro de los grandes fondos de cobertura, posiciones cortas abiertas en el mini SP500, en los futuros del SP500, apostando a que una bajada se va a dar en los próximos meses. Veremos quién acierta, si los grandes hedge funds cubriéndose ante lo peor que pueda pasar o los inversores minoristas que poco a poco, aunque se mantienen más bien neutrales, van desarrollando posiciones y van entrando en algunas empresas que estamos viendo rebotar, como las grandes tecnológicas, acciones más meme también, como veíamos viendo este primer trimestre del año un buen comportamiento de estas acciones y demás, y también criptomonedas, donde el Bitcoin ahora está perdiendo los $30.000, pero los conseguía traspasar hace unas cuantas sesiones. Bueno, miramos también hacia el último informe de Bank of America, el publicado por el famoso analista Michael Harnett, tan seguido durante el año pasado y durante este año. El año pasado acertó bastante sus pronósticos, este año veremos qué tal lo hace, pero ahora mismo está diciendo que la humillación al dólar es la temática de inversión más concurrida del mercado. Ya les contaba Marta Vilar, mi compañera, que Bank of America anunciaba que el cuarto mercado de bajista del dólar estadounidense había comenzado en los últimos 50 años. Y fíjense, esto es una de las imágenes del informe que comparte el equipo de Michael Harnett de Bank of America. Dicen, de hecho, dentro de la imagen, si miramos donde pone The Biggest Picture, la imagen global, dicen que el nuevo tema favorito ahora mismo es la caída del dólar. De hecho, lleva un menos 11% desde septiembre, mientras el oro ha superado los $2.000 la onza y el Bitcoin los 30.000, como les comentaba antes, aunque durante la sesión de hoy, si no me equivoco, los estaba perdiendo. Dicen que esto se debe a cambios drásticos seculares, como pueden ser, por ejemplo, los déficits, la deuda y la geopolítica. Dicen que el dólar estadounidense ahora mismo entraría en el cuarto mercado bajista en los últimos 50 años, y eso sería alcista para el oro, para el petróleo, para el euro y para los mercados internacionales. Pero, recalca Michael Harnett, el pesimismo es tan alto ahora y se están descontando caídas en los tipos de interés, se está descontando que la Fed recortará hasta 200 puntos básicos después de junio, pues entonces dice Michael Hartnett, ojo, cuidado, que ante esta humillación al dólar y tanto pesimismo y la temática más concurrida del corto dólar, pues podría sorprender y podríamos ver rebotes del dólar estadounidense. Rebotes que de hecho hoy estamos viendo. El DXY está desde el viernes intentando rebotar en la zona de los 100, tocaba los 100 puntos el índice dólar y intentando rebotar desde entonces. Acompaña otro gráfico dentro de este informe. Tenemos otra hoja del informe donde vemos cómo pues hacen referencia también a el tema de los bancos. La salida de los 105.000 millones de dólares de los bancos comerciales en las 2 últimas semanas incentiva las condiciones, hace que las condiciones para las pequeñas empresas sean todavía más duras y eso hace también que las condiciones se vayan restringiendo. Y como pueden ver, pues eso hace que el mercado laboral debería enfriarse, como apunta el gráfico 5. Nos trasladamos ya, dejamos de lado este informe de Bank of America para trasladarnos a el directo de la presidenta Christine Lagarde del Banco Central Europeo, que va a hablar sobre la inflación, las tasas de interés y los desafíos que enfrenta la recuperación económica de Europa.
Something that I have to do in my current position, and if I do step out a little bit away from the pure monetary policy angle, please forgive me and assume that it's off the record, which I know it's not. So I decided to accept the idea, and I do that reluctantly because I don't think that it's necessarily a pretty picture, but to accept the idea that we are moving towards a fragmented or a more fragmented world than we've had it, and that we are not necessarily in a completely bipolar situation, but that we might move in that direction, and that as a result of that, as central bankers, we have to look at what the options are, what the risks are, what the scenarios could be. So, we have seen the global economy go through major transitions and through a transformative movement, which I will summarize in steps. So we had the pandemic, we had the totally unjustified, unjustifiable and horrifying war of Russia against Ukraine. We had the weaponization of energy.
Bueno, pues como tienen ahí a Christine Lagarde diciendo que estamos viendo un mundo cada vez más polarizado. Utiliza la palabra multipolarizado en este entorno y habla de pues, todos los eventos que se han dado durante estos últimos años para abordar esta argumentación de que el mundo está cada vez más polarizado. Por ahora centra la atención ahí, veremos si desarrolla más.
With each bloc trying to pull as much of the rest of the world closer to its respective strategic interests and shared values. And this fragmentation, as I have mentioned, may well coalesce around 2 blocs led respectively by the United States of America and by China, the 2 largest economies in the world at the moment. And all these could have far-reaching implications across many domains of policy making. But today in my remarks, I would like to explore what the implications might be for central banks. In short, and I'm deliberately focusing on those 2 dimensions because there might be many others, and I'm sure that academics and scholars will explore many others. But from our perspectives, we could see 2 profound effects on the policy environment for central banks. First, we may see much more instability as global supply elasticity wanes. And second, we could see more multipolarity as geopolitical tensions continue to mount. So let's backtrack a little bit and let's remember the decades after the Cold War. The world benefited from a remarkably favorable geopolitical environment.
Bueno, pues la presidenta Christine Lagarde dice que la economía va hacia una fragmentación en 2 bloques. Lo reconocen ya desde el Banco Central Europeo. Dicen que los 2 bloques serían, por supuesto, China y Estados Unidos y que esto va a tener implicaciones para los bancos centrales, para la economía global también, pero en detalle sobre todo para los bancos centrales. Lo primero, una inestabilidad en cuanto al comercio y a la oferta Y lo segundo, un mundo, como les comentaba, más multipolar a medida que las tensiones se incrementan. Ahora Christine Lagarde está mirando cómo fue la transición o cómo se desarrolló a nivel económico el mundo después de la Guerra Fría.
Independent central banks, not in all countries of the world granted, but in our corners, could focus on stabilizing inflation by steering demand without having to pay too much attention to supply-side disruptions. But that period of relative stability may now be giving way to one of lasting instability, resulting in lower growth, higher costs, and more uncertain trade partnerships. Instead of more elastic global supply, we could face the risk of repeated supply shocks. Recent events have laid bare the extent to which critical supplies depend on stable global conditions. And that has been most visible in the European energy crisis that we have just gone through. But this is not it. It extends to other supplies. Today, the United States is completely dependent on imports from other countries in the world for at least 14 critical minerals. And Europe depends on China for 98% of its rare earth supply. Supply disruptions on those fronts could affect critical sectors of the economy, such as the automobile industry, especially as it transitions toward electric vehicle transition. In response, governments are legislating to increase supply security, notably through the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and the Strategic Autonomy Agenda in Europe. But that could in turn accelerate fragmentation as firms also adjust by anticipation. Indeed, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the share of global firms planning to regionalize their supply chain almost doubled to around 45% compared with a year earlier. And while we could assume that it was a mere intention, we are now seeing implementation of those determination. This new global map, as I have called it in another speech elsewhere, is likely to have first-order implications for central banks. One recent study, based on data since 1900, finds that geopolitical risks led invariably to high inflation, lower economic activity, and a fall in international trade. And ECB analysis suggests similar outcomes may be expected for the future. If global value chains fragment along geopolitical lines, the increase in the global level of consumer prices could range between around 5% in the short run and roughly 1% in the long run. I'm talking about consumer prices here. These changes could also suggest that a second shift in the central bank landscape is also taking place. We may see the world becoming more multipolar.
Es muy importante esto que acaba de comentar Christine Lagarde. No sabemos si es la excusa para darnos a entender que entramos en una época secular de mayor inflación y menor crecimiento, o es que realmente lo creen con este entorno multipolar del que está hablando la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo. Lo primero, ha hecho referencia a que vamos a ver mayores shocks de oferta, que al tener el comercio fragmentado en dos bloques, como bien ha comunicado antes, y tensiones geopolíticas, eso va a hacer que los shocks de oferta, como el que vivimos tras la pandemia, sean más habituales y se puedan ver más en el futuro. Habla de la dependencia de Estados Unidos y de Europa en China. Y claro, Europa y Estados Unidos lo que quieren hacer es regionalizar las cadenas de suministros y dicen que eso se está empezando a ver, que antes solamente se comentaba, pero ahora que ya se está empezando a hacer. Eso lo que va a hacer, dice que hay un estudio que desde 1900 calcula los riesgos geopolíticos y dice que normalmente los riesgos geopolíticos conllevan a mayor inflación, menor comercio y peor comportamiento económico, además de un incremento en los precios del consumidor, dice la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo.
Quite spread out. This had a range of mostly beneficial implications for central banks that accessed that level of international reserve. For example, the ability of central banks to act as, and I will quote Keynes here, the director of the international orchestra. It has also enabled firms to invoice in their domestic currencies, which made import prices more stable and predictable. That's for currencies. But in parallel, payment infrastructures. Now that's a topic, I tell you. So, but it's highly technical. It can come across as not so glamorous, but it's pretty important. So Western payment infrastructure assumed an increasingly global role. For instance, in the decade after the Berlin Wall fell, the number of countries using the payment messaging networks called SWIFT more than doubled. And by 2020, over 90% of cross-border transmissions were being signaled through SWIFT. But new trade patterns may have ramifications for payments and international currency reserves. In recent decades, China has already increased over 130-fold its bilateral trade in goods with emerging markets and developing economies, with the country also becoming the world's top exporter. And recent research indicates that there is a significant correlation between a country's trade with China and its holding in renminbi as reserves. New trade patterns may also lead to new alliances. One study finds that alliances can increase the share of a currency in the partner's reserve holdings by roughly 30 percentage points. Now, all this could create opportunities for certain countries seeking to reduce their dependency on our Western payment system and currency frameworks, be that for reasons of political preferences, financial dependency, or because of the sanctions that have been imposed for a decade now. Anecdotal evidence, including official statements, suggests that some countries intend to increase their use of alternative currencies for invoicing international trade, such as the Chinese renminbi or the Indian rupee. We are also seeing increased accumulation of gold as an alternative reserve asset, possibly driven by countries much closer geopolitically to China and to India. There are also attempts to actually override or set up an alternative system to SWIFT. Since 2014, Russia has developed such a system for domestic and cross-border use, with over 50 banks across a dozen countries using it last year. The accurate data in those matters are a bit difficult to assess, as you can imagine, but based on what we see, it's probably still the case that those banks in those 12 countries are using this alternative system. And since 2015, China has established its own system to clear all payments in renminbi. Now, these developments, and here I would agree with Krugman in the Time this morning, these developments do not point to an imminent loss of dominance for the US dollar or for the euro. The latter being far more dominant than, the former being far more dominant than the latter. So far the data do not show substantial changes in the use of international currencies, but they do suggest that international currency status should no longer be taken for granted, and that we should be really attentive to the currency in which trade transactions are organized. And that is, in my view, particularly the case for oil. So how should we, central banks, how should we respond to these twin challenges?
Bueno, es muy importante lo que acaba de decir aquí Christine Lagarde del Banco Central Europeo. Habla sobre la dominancia del euro y del dólar. Se está popularizando mucho últimamente el tema de que el dólar pierde su valor como valor refugio, como divisa refugio, y el euro también, y que lo ganan en cambio otras divisas internacionales debido al comercio. Bueno, pues Christine Lagarde habla de eso. Dice lo primero que China ha incrementado por 130 su comercio bilateral y que hay una correlación muy grande entre los países que hacen comercio con China y sus reservas de renminbi, de la divisa local. Dicen también que hay oportunidades para algunos países que quieran reducir su dependencia de las divisas occidentales debido a preferencias, acciones u otras cosas. Y que eso es lo que están notando, que en cuanto al comercio ya empieza a haber pagos en otras divisas que no son solo el dólar, que no son solo el euro, y que está habiendo oportunidades para algunos países para empezar a optar por ello, para otras divisas internacionales, debido, según sus preferencias, por no optar por una divisa occidental. Dicen también que algunos países intentan incrementar sus comercios en divisas como las que tiene China o las que tiene India, que el oro también se está demandando mucho en este escenario y que, según Christine Lagarde, no cree que haya una pérdida de dominancia a corto plazo del dólar y del euro. Pero que, claro, a largo plazo, ¿qué? Pues dice que sugiere que hay que vigilar las divisas internacionales y que no se deberían pasar por alto. Dice, deberíamos estar atentos a cómo se organizan los comercios mundiales.
If other policies are cooperative and help restructure and replenish supply capacity. For example, if fiscal and structural policies focus on removing supply constraints created by the new geopolitics, such as securing resilient supply chains or diversifying energy production or saving on energy, we could then see a virtuous circle of lower volatility, lower inflation, higher investment, and higher growth. That's the virtuous circle. But if fiscal policy instead focuses mainly on supporting incomes to offset cost pressures, that will tend to raise inflation, increase borrowing costs, and lower investment in new supply. Choice is clear. In this sense, insofar as geopolitics lead to a fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, this calls for greater policy cohesion. Not compromising independence, but recognizing the interdependence between policies and how each can best achieve their objective if aligned with a strategic goal. We certainly could see the benefit of that in Europe, especially where the multiplier effect of common action in areas such as industrial policy, defense, investing in green and digital technologies is much higher than if member states are acting alone. There is another benefit, that of achieving the right policy framework will not only determine how our economy fare at home, but also how they are viewed globally in a context of greater system competition. And while the international institutions established in the wake of Bretton Woods remain instrumental for fostering a rules-based multilateral order, the prospect of multipolarity raises the stakes for such internal policy cohesion. Charity begins at home. For a start, an economy policy mix that produces less volatile growth and inflation will be key in continuing to attract international investment. And although 50 to 60% of foreign-held US short-term assets are in the hands of government with strong ties to the United States, those that I think Janet Yellen calls the friends, meaning that they're unlikely to be divested for geopolitical reasons, the single most important factor influencing international currency usage remains the strength of fundamentals. And by that, we know that it is the rule of law, strong, respected institution, as well as open capital markets. By the same token, for Europe, long-delayed projects such as deepening and integrating our capital markets can no longer be viewed solely through the lens of domestic financial policy. To put it bluntly, we need to complete the European Capital Markets Union. This will be pivotal in determining whether the euro remains among the leading global currencies or others, those exotic ones that I mentioned earlier on, take its place. Central banks have an important role to play here, even as simple protagonists in that situation. For example, the manner in which swap lines are used could influence.
Bueno, pues a falta de que vuelva la señal, Christine Lagarde estaba comentando, tenemos que integrar la unión de los mercados de capitales en Europa y esto va a ser determinante y será crítico para la divisa, para el euro, para hacer que permanezca o para hacer que sea reemplazada por otras divisas internacionales, donde la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo estaba comentando cómo de hecho están empezando a haber mayor comercio mundial en otras divisas y que es una tendencia que se va notando, que no va a ser en el corto plazo, pero que no hay que ignorar a las divisas internacionales que no sean el euro y el dólar.
Such as innovating their payment systems, which I've touched upon earlier, and issuing digital currencies, will also be critical for which currencies ultimately rise and fall. And this is an important reason why we at the ECB are exploring in depth how a digital euro could best work if launched, while, and I know this is a debate in this country, respecting the privacy of European citizens and any of those using the digital euro. So, concluding my remarks and offering myself to the scrutiny and the questioning of my friend, Dr. Haas, we need to be ready for the new reality that may lie ahead. The time to think about how to respond to changing geopolitics is not when fragmentation is upon us, but before. And I would like to paraphrase someone whom I have read extensively and who spent a good share of his time in Europe, Ernest Hemingway, talking about a bankruptcy situation in The Sun Also Rises. I will paraphrase. I'm not talking about bankruptcy here. Don't get me wrong. He said, I'll say about fragmentation. Fragmentation can happen in two ways, gradually and then suddenly. The central bank must provide for stability in an age where it's anything but stable, and I have no doubt that central banks will measure up to the challenge. Certainly at the European Central Bank, we will. Thank you.
Bueno, pues la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo ha comentado sobre las monedas digitales. Su primera impresión, donde parece que están volcados desde el Banco Central Europeo, es que estamos mirando cómo funcionaría de mejor manera el euro digital y dicen respetando la privacidad de todos los individuos de la zona euro, que saben que es lo que importa sobre todo a los ciudadanos de esta región. Por otro lado, en conclusiones sobre su speech, dice tenemos que estar preparados para la nueva realidad, una nueva realidad donde hay que responder antes de que haya una mayor fragmentación entre dos bloques. Citaba una frase de Hemingway y concluye pues diciendo que se tiene que trabajar sobre todo esto a nivel geopolítico para evitar que vaya a algo mayor.
Moving up is geopolitical competition, industrial policy, fragmentation, supply chain disruption, accumulation of gold, and inflation and rates are much higher than they were and probably staying fairly high. Down is economic growth and growth in trade. Is that fair? Does that about sum it up?
I think it's a good summary of the key features. You're right, Richard. Okay. But I don't think that we should be necessarily pessimistic as a result of that. I think we should be determined. I'll tell you what, how all of that is correct. But I can't help looking back. Immediately after the infamous invasion of Russia, not the 2014 in Crimea, but the latest one in the eastern part of Ukraine. Yeah. At the time, the odds were that Europe was going to decline, growth will fall through the cracks, energy crisis would be such that we would be rationing the use of gas, petrol, oil, whatever you call it, and we would have social unrest. That was roughly the picture that was painted at the time. And You know, much to the surprise of many projectionists of sorts, Europe last year, 2022, delivered 3.5% growth, which, if you look at it, is more than China, more than the United States. And that's just little Europe. So that's number one. I mean, we all need to have reasons for hope, right? Because it's easy to be totally in this sort of doomsday loop. So number one. Number two, I think it was the European Commission which said, no, we all have to save on energy, and please try to save 15% because it's going to be tough. Well, guess what? The Europeans delivered 20% savings. Germany was highly dependent on Russia for its gas supply. And it was notorious that the building of LNG facilities, particularly the floating LNG facilities, would take at least 18 months. Well, guess what? They managed to build 3 floating LNG facilities in less than 6 months, and this is operating. And they are now not anymore dependent on Russian gas. Now, this is not the case for all countries because you still have some much smaller countries in Europe that are still receiving, Hungary is a point in case, that are still receiving some Russian gas. But this is, you know, an indication that when we want to do things to, you know, fight for the right cause, we can actually do it. So I draw some comfort from that ability to develop resilience and to do it together. In the same vein, after, you know, COVID hit all of us, the Europeans, who had never ever thought about that, decided to borrow jointly, to go on the market together.
Bueno, pues Christine Lagarde está mandando aquí un mensaje de resiliencia y también de confianza, disculpen, a la zona euro. Dice, de hecho, que, bueno, que ante todas las proyecciones que había tan negativas sobre Europa, sobre la crisis energética, sobre el difícil invierno, pues dice que Europa creció en 2022 al 3,5%, más que China y que Estados Unidos, enfatiza más que China y que Estados Unidos, esto es importante. Dice que los europeos han ahorrado más energía de la que se esperaba. También hacía el ejemplo de Alemania, cómo ha fabricado esas, bueno, cómo ha conseguido depender menos de la energía rusa y cómo ahora pues ha salido adelante en cuanto al proceso de gas natural, el GNL, ¿no? Bueno, dice que tenemos resiliencia en Europa y que es algo por lo que estar orgullosos. Vamos a ver qué dice más la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo.
The reading on inflation was 10.3%. Our projection for 23 is 5.3%. So we are dividing by 2. I'm not saying that it's all on monetary policy. Don't get me wrong. The fact that oil prices have gone down significantly, that we have base effects and all that, and that the bottlenecks are gradually fading out is also playing a role. But yes, one comes with the other.
Speaking about rates, is there any reason to tie ourselves in knots to reach the 2% level? Are you one of those central bankers who believes that anything above 2% automatically institutionalizes inflation and builds expectations? Or do you think that's an arbitrary rate for which we have to thank New Zealand for and we can safely ignore it?
I think for the moment, given the strategic objective that we have, given the fight that we take, there is absolutely no reason to change that 2% medium-term objective. So it will be that 2% medium-term objective. Once we get there, once we are confident that it stays there, we can discuss that again. I'll come back, I promise. And I'll answer your question.
Okay, I look forward to it. You're always welcome. I may not be here to issue the invitation, but you're still welcome.
You can come.
Of course, I have to. So let's talk about banking for a second.
Bueno, le preguntan a Christine Lagarde sobre si podría haber un cambio, ¿no?, en la inflación objetivo, en ese 2% de inflación que siempre comentan los bancos centrales. Dice que no hay razón todavía para cambiar el objetivo de inflación. Eso sí, dice, una vez lleguemos ahí, lo volveremos a discutir. Veremos qué dice la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo una vez lleguen al objetivo, si es que llegan.
A little bit of yes on both sides. So, if I look at what happened in the 3 weekends prior to Easter Passover weekend. We had Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, followed by Credit Suisse, followed by some trepidation around Deutsche Bank. And I would say, particularly on the first two episodes, Silicon, Signature, and then Credit Suisse, I would say that those three institutions had serious management issues, some of which was well known and had been for a long time. That is the case for Credit Suisse, for sure. Others, clearly, given the risk management that became apparent, the lack of hedging, the maturity transformation that was applied, and the concentration and aggregated clientele of those banks, plus, in the case of Signature Bank, the very strange, and I have no reason yet to believe that it is the case, but I think the audit and the review will demonstrate it, but the alleged money laundering and hanky-panky business going on around the cryptos that were cleared through a Bahamas bank using then Signature Bank. So you have all that in a context, and that's where I come to the second part of your question, in a context where the financial markets, which was used to very low interest rates, sometimes negative interest rates in the case of Europe, suddenly saw a major transformation of the environment in which they operated, because interest rates increased at a speed that we had not seen in decades, and that was not anticipated. So to take the example of the ECB, we went from minus 0.5, so minus 50 basis points, to 300 basis points for the key policy rate. So 350 basis points in a matter of 9 months. It's unprecedented. And the Fed moved by higher amounts, having started a little bit earlier than us and facing a slightly different situation. So the environment in which they operated, the business models that they had developed over the years, was suddenly transformed under their eyes, and those who had not anticipated it, or who have not anticipated it, clearly are facing and have faced issues. I think that lesson learned, just in the way in which the Liz Truss budget development taught all of us a lesson about, how you can't just mess around with fiscal policies unless it's properly funded. I think that banks are observing, and regulators and supervisors are also observing very carefully the lessons learned from these situations.
You talked in your opening comments about the fact that the world has made some.
Bueno, pues aquí la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, Christine Lagarde, hace referencia a la alta subida de tipos de interés y sobre todo drástica que ha sido en los últimos 9 meses. Dice, hemos pasado de una tasa en la tasa general del menos 0,5%, menos 50 puntos básicos, al 3%. Eso es una subida de 350 puntos básicos en 9 meses, una subida imprecedente y que, por tanto, todavía no sabemos cómo va a afectar, ¿no?
I had confidence in this country not to go to that extreme, and I was hoping that politicians of all ranks, files, sides of the aisles would come to their sense and put the nation first and not their political preference or the bickering that often is associated with difficult debates. Because no one in this room or beyond can imagine the United States defaulting on its debt. I mean, this is beyond imagination. And that would be the natural consequences of, not making the right decision comes June. And it would not be, deflagration in this country. It would send shockwaves around the world.
And more specifically,
I remember 2011 because I came to Washington in 2011 when I was appointed head of the IMF, and there was the same debate. And I'll never forget, I don't know if it was Margaret Brennan or somebody else, who turned to me and said, well, is the United States going to knock on the door of the IMF? It was like, what? I had been told that it would be a walk in the park, but the United States knocking on the door of the IMF, and I said, no, this is not possible. Not possible.
So, you've run the IMF, you've now spent the last...
Bueno, entre risas, la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, Christine Lagarde, comenta que el impago de la deuda de Estados Unidos, en referencia a ese techo de deuda del que tanto se está hablando, si Estados Unidos hiciese un impago sobre su deuda, eso sería inimaginable y mandaría un impacto no solo a Europa, sino a todo el mundo. Dice que también en 2011 había el mismo debate, cuando ya estaba en el Fondo Monetario Internacional, y que, bueno, y que Estados Unidos quiso llamar a la puerta del Fondo Monetario Internacional, pero que dice Christine Lagarde que de ningún modo, y por tanto, pues que este impago de la deuda sería inimaginable y que no está contemplado, ¿no? Dice que por ahora hay poca imaginación de que eso pase, porque mandaría un impacto, como dice, a todo el mundo.
I will address your question from two angles, Richard. I think that there is one revolution which I have not touched on, which will transform the ways in which all of us conduct business, the way in which institutions operate, the way in which we inform our decision, and maybe the way decisions are made. And that is the role of artificial intelligence. I think that, we have considered that technology would be a tool, would be the backbone of things that we, human beings, put on the top. I think we should just be very, very attentive to what is happening and what generative artificial intelligence is going to help produce as additional layers are added to this. And I'm not saying that specifically in relation to the Bretton Woods institutions, but I think that the more global the role, the broader the volume of data and the information and the difficulty of decision making are, the more artificial intelligence should be leveraged, used, controlled, and put to the service of those who are giving mandate to the institutions. So that's one thing. I've been head of the IMF for 8 years. And for many years, I have worked hard as head of the IMF to reform the quotas. This has been a perennial discussion, and it always was in debate, before me and after me. And it's a terribly complicated topic because it's like having a big cake. And some members, the United States, the European countries, Japan to a certain extent, have a share of the cake, and then all the others have much, 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 much smaller shares. And you can increase the size of the cake, but the size of the share as a proportion of the overall cake are jealously, scrupulously scrutinized as an indication of authority, power, role in this world. And I don't know how we sort out this issue. But it cannot be so that some of the largest emerging economies, including China, remain with that relatively small share of the cake, considering their size, considering their development. And if we want to avoid that new institutions be strengthened, set up, and in a rival situation to existing institutions, we need to break that knot, because otherwise we shouldn't be surprised to see, the Asian infrastructure bank, other institutions being set up in the future, and we shouldn't be surprised to see that some of those debts that need restructuring, particularly in some of the most fragile and lowest income countries, are in debate. Because one of the players who is becoming a big lender doesn't want to participate because he or she, funny
Very
enough,
good. Not easy to pun in a second language.
doesn't feel part of the club.
Last question for me, then we'll open up talking about the club of central bankers. say something about the interaction between and among you. And in particular, you're not all equal. The American Central Bank, the Fed, obviously has a bit more clout. But also what it does has tremendous implications, not just for the United States, but for the rest of the world. And without putting you in an overly awkward position, there are lots of criticisms about how the Fed managed inflation, whether it was slow to take the punch bowl away. And say something about the formal and informal interaction among you and your colleagues in the United States, in Japan, and so forth. Is it adequate? Is the problem where it's inadequate the machinery, or is it simply, it's not an institutional question, it's simply a communication and personality question?
You know, I will not go into the debate of...
I knew you wouldn't, but I thought I'd try.
But no, I'm happy to address the issue of our communication, because we are interdependent. What happens in the United States matters for the rest of the world. I happen to think that what happens in Euro can also affect the rest of the world. And we saw very clearly a few years back that what happens in China can also have an impact in the rest of the world.
Sure.
And we remain to see what the Bank of Japan is going to do with its yield curve control and what the consequences will be going forward. So I think that we are, I don't think anybody would dispute that we are interdependent and that what we do affects markets in general, with a prevailing role by the Fed. It's obvious, given the depth of the markets, given the role of the dollar, both as a reserve currency and otherwise. And we do communicate a lot. It might not seem institutionalized enough to some who like to write about that and produce report. We see each other very much at meetings of the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, which operates like the sort of central bank of central banks. And we see each other, and we saw each other on WebEx, and we have a mix of physical...
Bueno, le han preguntado a Christine Lagarde sobre si están muy en comunicación los diferentes bancos centrales y sobre todo si las medidas de un banco central afectan también al resto. Bueno, aquí Christine Lagarde dice que somos muy interdependientes. Dice, lo que pasa en Estados Unidos afecta al mundo, lo que pasa en el euro quiere creer que también afecta al mundo. Y lo mismo, lo que ocurre en China, también dice, afecta al mundo porque somos muy interdependientes, pero siempre con una mirada prevaleciente en el dólar y en lo que hace la Fed, que dice que tiene mucho más impacto en el mundo global. Dice también que siguen muy dependientes de lo que hará Japón con su política expansiva y su control de la curva de tipos, porque eso también afectará a los diferentes bancos centrales y al mundo entero. Y habla de que comunican mucho entre los diferentes bancos. Dice que la comunicación es muy fluida y que puede no parecer institucional, pero que está ahí, que comunican bastante. Vamos a escuchar las preguntas de los periodistas.
Close working partner with Christine for many, many years. So I want to thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts. And I would like to get your thought in particular. You used the pun he and she. In this case, it's one person. And the idea of what China faces as its biggest challenges over the next couple of years. We tend to look at China from an international point of view and its policies vis-a-vis the US and the world, whereas China is looking very deeply at its own challenges, its own internal challenges. Can you share your thoughts on what they are and what challenges it needs to deal with at home over the next, say, 2 to 5 years?
Shall I answer right away?
Yeah, sure.
Bob, thank you so much, and it's lovely to see you. I would say one word: demographics. I think that's the big issue, and it's one that President Xi has recognized for a long time, and I'm not sure that anybody knows how to solve it.
You can't do much about it. It's true. Well, look, Bob, I'm going to squeeze in some others, but because obviously...
Bueno, le han preguntado, primera pregunta hacia la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, si es que China tiene sus propios desafíos, porque Christine Lagarde ha hablado de China en un marco internacional, pero le preguntan si dentro del país, dentro de China, tienen sus desafíos propios para los siguientes 2 a 5 años. ¿Cuál sería la opinión de Christine Lagarde? Bueno, ha respondido que la demografía es el mayor problema de China, que el propio presidente Xi lo ha reconocido y que nadie sabe realmente cómo solucionarlo. Vamos a escuchar más.
They can also and hopefully will play a significant role in debt restructuring for the low-income countries and the fragile countries, and that clearly would have an impact on private creditors as well, and they could play a key role.
Let's get a digital question, virtual question.
We'll take our next question from Andrew Gunlock.
Greetings, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Madam Lagarde, I share your view on fragmentation, and thank you for sharing it. Your vision of fragmentation for Europe, however, is your banking system optimized for that world? You don't have a global champion like JP Morgan or like BlackRock. You have some significant national champions. But do you see a need for greater European banking cross-border integration, and how will you achieve it? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. The answer to your question is yes, by all means. And I think that the developments that we've seen lately, you know, the Mad March developments in particular, will hopefully push policymakers in that direction. Those who can make decisions here are the European Commission, the European Council, the European Parliament. All I can do is push, 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 push. The other person who is also push, 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 push is Pascal Donoghue, who is the president of a subset, which is the Eurogroup, which brings together 20 member states, including France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and many others. And we are strongly pushing in that direction because we need to have cross-border mergers taking place in order to have the scale and the size that would compare with some of those that you have just mentioned. I think there are two projects that really warrant a big effort, and it's difficult because I'm not sure that voters, and we are heading towards 2024 where there will be a European election, I'm not sure that voters are going to be terribly excited if you tell them that we need banking union, we need capital market union. That's a tough political message to have. But it's critically important. And not just to compete, but to coexist and to be strong together.
You don't think that would get people out of the streets of Paris? Sir.
Mark Rosen, was also at the IMF, US Executive Director, and served with you, and with great pleasure, and great to see you again. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Christine, you mentioned offshoring, friendshoring, and Janet Yellen's concept, which is, I think, very interesting. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts about friendshoring, and particularly, what is the prospects, in your view, for deepening economic, financial relationships between Europe and the US? Is most of it done, or are there still many areas that we could build on right now?
Thank you, Mark. Good to see you too. Friendshoring, an interesting concept, as long as you know for sure who is a friend, who is a foe. And I have discussed that with Ngozi, the head of the WTO, who has a much larger view of trade movements and how much volume inflows, outflows there is at the moment as a result of the geopolitical changing landscape. And the point she makes, which I would endorse, and I've thought about it, is that it's not just the sort of natural friends, those who share values, who have had history together, who fought shoulder to shoulder, which should be taken for granted. But we together do not necessarily have access to the right minerals, to the right rare earth, to some of the components that are going to be used more and more in this technologically shaken world. So I think we need to go a little bit beyond the pure definition of friends by reference to principles, values, shared history, and go beyond that and make sure that we institutionalize links. I was going to say dependency, but I don't really mean dependency, but sufficient bounds so that we are in this together. Everyone has skin in the games. And this is something that has been played out quite well by others. And I think that we should not drop that ball. We should actually hold it together and play that game in order to have a combination of friendshoring and localization of joint materials, resources that we can search and secure together. I think that's an area where the Europeans and the Americans can actually join forces and be strong allied, I would hope.
Do you think they can join forces in a way that is not inherently protection?
Bueno, le preguntan a Christine Lagarde, lo primero, si el sistema bancario está preparado para la fragmentación. Dice esta fragmentación que ha comentado ella misma en su discurso, el que el mundo va a dos bloques, pues dice que espera que los acontecimientos recientes que ha habido en la banca, esos miedos tras las quiebras que vimos en marzo, pues empujen a los dirigentes a tomar mejores decisiones y a que el sistema bancario, por lo menos europeo, pueda tener mayores fusiones transfronterizas y sea más fuerte de cara a esta posible fragmentación a nivel global. Dice, necesitamos, y es crítico, unión bancaria y ser fuertes juntos. Por otro lado, le han preguntado sobre el friendshoring y la relación entre Estados Unidos y Europa. Y dice que no solo lo que debe unir a la gente que hace negocios juntos es la historia y los valores y la forma de hacer negocios, sino que tenemos que ir más allá en la definición de amigos dentro de ese friendshoring, que es la tendencia geopolítica actual. Y dice que deberíamos asegurarnos de conseguir relaciones donde todo el mundo participe, donde todo el mundo tenga skin in the game. Deberíamos jugar a ese juego y ahí los europeos y los estadounidenses dice que pueden unirse para ser más fuertes. Vamos a seguir escuchando.
Yeah, of course. Interest rate hiked, better for the banks. That's, I think, the instant reading. But then you think a bit longer and harder and you think about the other side of the balance sheet and the impact that it could have on, the solidity of certain loans, the credit conditions, the provisions that should be taken. And I think that we are still exploring, and the banks are also exploring those aspects as well. So I'm not sure that it's a net positive. Thank you.
Another one from afar.
Take our next question from Samuel Visner.
Thank you, Madame Lagarde. I'm Sam Visner. I'm a cybersecurity expert at the Aerospace Corporation. I would be grateful for your view regarding the regulatory challenges and the challenges associated with maintaining a stable international financial system as we move in the direction of cryptocurrency. So far, it seems to me that stability has not been the first word that comes to mind. And in terms of managing a stable financial system, I would be grateful to hear what you think are the challenges.
Bueno, le preguntan a Christine Lagarde sobre la regulación de las criptomonedas de cara ahora a este futuro interbancario y también en las nuevas leyes. Vamos a ver qué responde, enseguida se lo contamos, pero nosotros antes nos vamos a publicidad. Enseguida volvemos con Rolling Stocks.
En esta comunidad estamos muy concienciados con el ahorro de agua. Mirad, mirad, Rosa está regando la planta del rellano con el agua de cocer verduras. El niño que se está duchando. Carlitos, la ducha lo más corta posible. Una canción. Y el aceite usado al punto limpio, ¿vale? Sabéis que el váter no es un cubo de basura, ¿verdad? Esto sí. Cuando enjabones lo que sea, cierra el grifo. ¡Ese grifo! Soy Isabel, la del segundo. ¿Cómo os lo tengo que decir? Ahorra agua y cuida el medio ambiente.
¿Las soluciones de inversión tradicionales ya no cumplen con sus objetivos financieros? ¿La escasa rentabilidad y la volatilidad de los mercados le empujan a mantener los ahorros en su cuenta corriente? Si la respuesta a ambas preguntas es afirmativa, lo más probable es que esté pensando que la opción de no invertir es la óptima. Esta alternativa es quizás la más inmediata, pero ciertamente no parece la más rentable. Nuestros productos de generación de rentas están diseñados para ofrecerle el equilibrio adecuado entre seguridad y rentabilidad, con el fin de aprovechar todas las oportunidades del mercado. Hemos revisado nuestro enfoque tradicional, ampliando el espectro de oportunidades dentro del segmento de rentas para una inversión que le prepare mejor para el futuro. Y con la integración de los principios ESG, podemos ayudar a construir un futuro más verde para todos los inversores que buscan rentabilidad. No se conforme con la liquidez. Prepárese para el futuro con fondos de Invesco. Descubra más en invesco.es/income.
Continuamos por aquí y nosotros vamos directamente ya hacia el cierre de bolsas europeas.
Admirals invierte sin comisiones en más de 4.000 activos.
Bueno, pues parece ser que las palabras de la presidenta del BCE, del Banco Central Europeo, Christine Lagarde, no han gustado mucho a los mercados, pero bueno, aún así, una jornada tranquila. Vemos el Eurostoxx 50 en Europa cayendo medio punto porcentual, cae un menos 0,63%. Disculpen, ahí tienen la caída en el día de hoy, después de todas las semanas, estas últimas con tono positivo. Empezamos a ver cierto tono negativo en el Eurostoxx 50, menos 0,66%. Ahora mismo, si miramos los diferentes índices, en Alemania el DAX cae también, eso sí, ligeramente cercano a cero, un 0,11%, no es mucha caída, como vemos un día también, a pesar de que sea más negativo que el resto, todavía la volatilidad muy controlada. El CAC 40, el índice francés, cae en este caso 0,28%, vemos también un día tranquilo, aunque en tono negativo tocaba consolidar, tocaba retroceder un poco después de tanta subida. El IBEX 35, eso sí, se mantiene en positivo ahora mismo en un 0,17% la sesión de hoy. Si miramos en Reino Unido, el día podría haber sido prácticamente plano, vemos un 0,10% en positivo, no hay casi volatilidad, no hay casi movimiento, como vemos, cierra prácticamente plano. Y en Italia, el índice de Milán, que cae, eso sí, un 0,62%. Este ha sido el cierre de mercados europeos, que sobre todo se caracteriza por bastantes índices en negativo, pero volatilidades muy bajas, poca caída en general.
Admirals invierte sin comisiones en más de 4.000 activos.
Y yo me despido ya, cerramos Rolling Stocks, justo acaba de terminar la presidenta